Do you feel yourself feeling a little bewildered sometimes at some of the ways things are going and finding it hard to find your bearings? You wouldn't be alone. We live in a unique moment in history. Every so often, a seismic shift happens in society. The Industrial Revolution happened around 1765, and it represented a shift from an agrarian society where people were craftsmen and would be responsible for the whole production of things, and societies were largely based around villages. And as industry developed and people became themselves seen as resources, parts of machines, and we started talking about human resource management, the whole society started to organise itself around this way of thinking. One of the great benefits of the Industrial Revolution was we were able to produce huge amounts of product in very sustainable ways. We are in an Industrial Revolution kind of moment. From 1765, there was a trajectory that was set right the way through till the late 20th century. From about the year 2000 onwards, we entered a new era. And have you noticed, it feels like change has sped up. Can you believe the World Wide Web itself was only invented in 1989? That things like the iPad was only invented in 2002. Things that are so, normal for us, like Facebook was only invented in 2004, and Zoom, that was only invented in 2011. These technology platforms are not the sole reason for some of the seismic change, but they are symbolic of it. So let's have a talk about what this networked world we're living in means at the moment. In this networked world, most of us find ourselves responsible for promoting ourselves. Rather than being part of a big organisation that tells us what our career path should be, or part of a church that charts our life course for us, most of us find ourselves responsible for promoting ourselves. And some people spend a lot of time on Facebook or Instagram or social media trying to portray an image of themselves. This is part of the reality we find ourselves in. At the same time as each one of us is responsible for promoting and steering our own path, increasingly, more and more of us are working alone. More and more of us are finding through bits and pieces of work, through apps like Uber, where people can do piecework, or even in organisations where work now increasingly gets farmed out, we're finding ourselves working alone. And this trend and many of the trends that are part of our network reality have been turbocharged by COVID-19. And it's like COVID-19 it's sped us up by a decade or so in terms of heading towards the kind of world we find ourselves stepping into at the moment. Another part of the moving away from the industrial era of organising ourselves and moving into this networked era is that there is a fundamental loss of trust in organisations, authority structures, and the big stories that used to give life meaning. So we don't trust ourselves to an organisation anymore. There was a day when you would get employed as a 15-year-old in the organisation and you would retire in that same organisation 50 or 60 years later. No longer. We don't trust ourselves to organisations. We don't trust ourselves to politicians. And the stories that would give life meaning, like Christianity, are no longer trusted in the same way. What is trusted in our networked world is our own understanding of what is true. And so people are left talking about their truth, their reality, and probably the greatest sin in our increasingly networked world is not being true to yourself, which from a biblical understanding, we understand to be a dangerous thing because there's more than one side to us. And so truth is subjective in this networked world. Another major shift in this networked world is that we're There was I don't know if you picked up, there's not a really healthy TV series, but an interesting TV series called Mad Men that talked about the advertising industry. And whereas the advertising used to be a broad thing that targeted major demographics, now marketers can have extensive information about you and market specifically to you on the basis of psychological research. While at the same time we're trusting big organizations less and less, those big organizations have learnt how to target you in ways that other generations previously couldn't have imagined. And increasingly, we're all living in our own realities as we find ourselves in the recipients of messages that are unique to us. Increasingly, mass media, the voices we used to trust on the nightly news, is being consumed less and less. Media is being more and more personally specific. Another shift, as part of a result of all of this, is that loneliness is becoming an epidemic. At the same time, we're more connected than ever. More and more of us are suffering from things like depression and anxiety, and more of us are feeling socially isolated. One of the realities of this networked world is that those who have more connections, it's a general rule of networks, those who have more connections will do better than those who have less connections. And there's all kinds of research to show that the more connections you have, the more money you have, the healthier you will be, the better education you will get. That in this networked world, wealth is not so much about dollars and cents, but about connections. And finally, while in this networked world, communication is easier than ever before, there are so many voices out there, and communication about good things is less easy than communication about stuff that's unhelpful. It is far easier to provoke negative emotions than to provoke positive emotions. So we see that on our commercial television stations, they find it easier to put on shows that provoke unhealthy emotions. We see in social media, it's far easier to get likes and to get response to provoke unhealthy emotions. And so at a time where the church is more able than ever before to communicate the message of Jesus Christ, we find ourselves awash with all kinds of messages, and often we're not so equipped to communicate the message in this landscape. These are just some of the realities we now find ourselves in. These were not realities in the same way 20 years ago. We are, as we're saying, going through this seismic shift, and we need to work out what kind of church do we need to be in this networked reality.